Hi everybody, Mike Armiger here. I hope that you're okay and that you're taking good care of yourself. It's a very challenging time at the moment for many. So I hope that whilst you're viewing this, that you know that our love, our thoughts and everything are with you at the moment. I wanted to just take a very short bit of your time to just give you some ideas and some thoughts as to what it is we can do to support both key workers' children, both in the home and then both within a school environment as well. Some of the things which are really, really difficult for many young children is to work with the ever-changing contexts, and it's very hard as well to deal with the truth, I think, as well for some of our young people, because rightly so, adults don't want to tell them things that are not true, and similarly don't want to give them too much of the difficult detail. So finding that balance is especially difficult for those of us that are still going into work. As a key worker myself, both in education and within mental health services at the moment, I understand some of the real challenges that we face around both our loved ones having concern for us going into work and especially young children. So I'm going to share with you, I'm just going to take a short amount of your time to just share with you some ideas that we can think about both in the home and both within maybe educational provisions to support those key workers' children. So I'm just going to share with the screen with you for just a second. Bear with me. I'm hoping that this will be very smooth and professional looking. Excellent. There we go. Not as bad as I thought it'd be. So I'm going to move me into the corner and I'm just going to talk through some of the slides that I've got here. I've got about 4 slides for you and just outlining some concepts that you might want to think about. One of the really important things to think about with any potentially difficult situation is how much sometimes it involves acts of imagination for children. So because they're not exposed sometimes to those direct environments where perhaps our parents might be going in to work either within the National Health Service, postal workers, delivery drivers, educators, all of those different things, there's quite a bit of ambiguous space around actually what that adult is doing, the situation, all of those things. And what happens is that when there's a little bit of ambiguous space and there's uncertainty, our children fill those with lots of different things. Sometimes the children fill it, I've written down here, they fill it, there's elements of catastrophizing thought. So, what will happen is that they might sometimes go to the worst possible case scenario, 0 to 100 miles an hour, very, very quickly. So really spending some time to clarify what questions they have and understanding what misinterpretations there might be are really important things for us to do. Also, given a little bit of context in a physical sense and a visual sense as to where we're actually going to work. Now, appropriate context around this conversation is really important. I'm not saying that you take photos if you're working in ICU, for example, when you're fully downed in PPE. Obviously, that might have a counter effect for some of our young people and some of our children. But one of the things that you can do is utilise colleagues. One of the things that has happened with many of the key workers going into education provisions and that I've spoken to, and they found it reassuring for their children, is that when they've been talking about the things that I can explain to my young people, what they've said is that actually they've utilised the free school meals and the difficulty that they've had in getting those sorts, I understand. But actually they've sent photos of them preparing food for their children. So it's a photograph and some context around some of the stuff that they're doing that is low in intensity, but also not necessarily massively invasive and concerning. So it's given them some visual context for what those adults are doing when they're separated from their young person. If you're working in health settings, one of the things that has been quite useful for some of my colleagues has been getting their colleagues to record some messages for some of their young people or showing them photos of the people that they're working with. Again, thinking about the PPE issue and thinking about whether or not it's appropriate to send those things, what effect it might have. But using photographs and all of those things to make sure that actually there's some element of understanding as to where you're going, what you're doing, the safety provisions that you have around you, all of those different things. So you will know how to think about those things carefully. I know that. When you're working with key workers' children in schools as well, what might also be appropriate is there might be some element of crossover that they might need with them in terms of maybe a possession, maybe a smell, lots of different things that are based on sensory stimulus. Now that can be difficult with transmission. We need to be very careful around those things for sure, and we need to be appropriate. But working on the sensory level is really, really important for our parents and for our young people, because often what happens, for instance, many of the foster carers that I work with will perhaps spray their perfume on the blanket or something before they go. So there's that real sense of assurance, attachment, safety, all of those things, but on a sensory level, not necessarily on a cognitive level. So that's maybe another additional layer that you can think about using. What I would be really clear on doing is identifying and clarifying what questions they have and where appropriate, and not necessarily being communicating that we're going to be able to answer all of those things, but maybe give an appropriate context in the areas that we absolutely can. So for instance, when I'm going into mental health services at the moment, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to communicate with children some of the difficulties that we're experiencing, obviously, some of the scenes. We wouldn't do that anyway, but I'm particularly being very mindful and very careful around some of the conversations around lack of protective gear, government, lots of different things that are particularly complex and difficult. And right now, I'm being very mindful as to how those conversations might be overheard and interpreted. So again, we're all very good at doing that, but just making sure that we're paying extra attention to that at this moment in time might be an idea. But be aware of that ambiguous space and understand that it's a very, very normal response for children to question and fill it with lots of different elements of uncertainty and misinterpretation. For children who take things very literally, that understanding of, they might have seen somebody in the health service donning full PPE on the TV and think that that's maybe what you're doing when you go in. And if you're working in separate areas where there might not necessarily be full visors for PPE or lots of different elements, then it means that you can use something a little bit different in terms of photographic and visual aids. So some other things to think about as well in terms of both parents and young people is also thinking about those routines around transitioning. So at the moment, there's a huge amount of hygiene anxiety. And hygiene anxiety in particular is something which, both in terms of us supporting key worker children and us as parents, is something we're not quite sure how to always get right. And that's completely dependent on the individual. Obviously, they're massively important. They need to take place regardless of what we communicate with our young people. But just think about whether or not they're visible or they're invisible. So for instance, a lot of our parents are obviously having to take their clothes off sometimes when they come in through the front door, and for some children that's causing increasing anxiety. So I know some parents and some key workers that have put their clothes outside the front door and then done that separately, where they're able to, of course, depending on where they live and what they have around them. But just thinking about those additional steps and actually where they're visible and where they might not necessarily need to be visible, and where they might be a little bit more invisible because of the anxiety levels around our children, is something to maybe think about. Autonomy over goodbyes is really key in that transition. I mean, it's not going to be possible, obviously, for them to come to work and for them to follow us for sure, but providing that safety for us to make sure that we can do that. And maybe it's about when we have that handover period, if we're dropping children into school, some of the school staff can maybe support that handover period a little bit more practically by maybe designating zones maybe for them to pull over outside the school where they maybe wouldn't normally do so. So for instance, normally obviously we're not allowing children, adults to pull up on certain parts of the school roads maybe, or coming into a certain car park, where we need to make sure that we're using physical distancing. It might also be appropriate for the purpose of easier transition and easier handover for that maybe to be thought about, whether or not that physical representation of them coming into the school parking or parking very close to the school, and where they can see a member of staff in front of them ready for that handover, that might mean something for some young people. It's entirely dependent on what staffing levels we have and what we have available to us. Think about as well, I mean, as much as I mentioned ongoing communication earlier, it might also be the fact that some of that communication could possibly be counterproductive, too much maybe. So thinking about what level we put in. How can we build regulation and safety into these routines? This is something I'm going to talk to you about now, okay? So have a think about some of our young people in the homes, in schools at the moment. And a lot of what we do is we talk to young people about the way that they feel and what's going on for them at the moment. And that's fine and that's understandable. But also understand that for many of them, they might not be able to articulate that. So what we need to do at the moment is we need to think about what adaptations physically might be happening in our young people's nervous systems. So what you might start to see is signs of dysregulation or signs of stress within a young person's physical and emotional state that might be physically visible. So it might be the fact that you start looking at areas of tension. I'll come on to certain specifics that you can do in a second. But whilst they're in a provision, whilst the key workers' children are there, whilst also they're at home, think about what you might be, what you might be able to do for your young children in terms of observing them physically and seeing if there's any physical indicators of what they might have picked up in terms of adaptation. So the things I'm talking about might be, for instance, that you might see some form of rhythmic movement. So it might be the fact that maybe there's more repetitive movement, maybe in terms of twitches. You might see some physical tics. You might see, for instance, maybe they're holding tension in their shoulders have come up. You might see, for instance, that there's maybe they might be rotating the neck a little bit. There might be some tension in their neck. It might be the fact that they're using certain footwork patterns or certain pacing. There's lots of different things that you can pick up just from watching. But the problem is that at the moment what we're doing, and understandably so, is that we're expecting our young people to be able to say, right, this is what's going on, this is how I'm feeling. But some of them absolutely might not be aware of that. But utilising the skills of physical observation to understand where they're holding tension physically in their body will be very useful, because it will also work with some of those children who might be a little bit oppositional to maybe talking about how they're feeling or not able to have the language skills, who might be neurodiverse, all of those different things. So working on the physical level might be something that you can do. So think about very carefully within a school environment, if you're working with children of key workers, to think about physically where they might be holding that tension. And if you have any physical observations, maybe pass that over as further information to parents. In the home, if you're noticing that your children are holding tension in certain areas, then maybe it might be an idea to see if there's some form of routine that you can put in around that in the evenings, in the morning, during the daytime, etc., that might meet some of those physical adaptations. This is normal, it will happen. Do not worry if your children are showing different physical behaviours that you might not have seen before, or they might be more pronounced than maybe they were previously. That's okay, that's going to happen. Noticing them means we're a couple of steps ahead of that. So it's a really good thing if you can pick some of that information up, because it means that you'll be able to have a starting place on where we can go forward with it. Some things that you might want to think about in terms of physical indicators. Okay, so now for this, it's very difficult for some young people because of what we call interoception. So interoception is the ability to feel physically what's going on inside our body. It's something I talk about quite regularly around sensory integration, all of those things. So some of the things that you can notice and look out for will be things like actually, they report in different temperature, raises or drops within certain parts of their body. Is it actually that, we know that children that are experiencing shock, or the children that are feeling quite withdrawn can sometimes feel very, very cold, and their temperature can plummet from the waist down when it comes to things like disassociation and lots of those different things. So as much as these things might be a little bit concerning initially, they can be very understood according to some of the emotional strain that we're under. Of course, some of these things do not necessarily just mean emotional impact. It's also important to put the context of the things that we're currently seeing at the moment. The temperature raises could also have a direct health implications that we just need to be aware of. I need to put that in. But understanding around where they're holding tension, think about the way they're sitting. So for instance, a lot of children, at the moment, we need to work with them on grounding them quite a lot. They need to be able to maybe feel the floor a little bit more. So if they're doing things that are on the floor, activities that are based on being down on the ground, would be a really good idea to keep them as low as possible to the ground, to keep them grounded. You'll notice in science labs, for instance, high seating, legs constantly swing, don't they? There's that rhythmic element of regulation, and their needs being met through that swinging of legs maybe, or pushing up of their feet, all of those different things. So, activities that you can do on the floor, notice body positions, all of those different things. Those are really good details to start working and understanding what our young people are going through in terms of habit and physically how their needs are currently being met. Think about breathing patterns as well. So, breathing patterns will adapt according to the strain or the tension or the stress that some of our children might be holding. So, for instance, one of the things that you might see is that breathing patterns might become a little bit more shallow. So you might see, for instance, that some of our young children every now and again go, and they have to take a sharp intake of breath. Now, that can commonly be associated with them not breathing as deeply as they possibly could. So it's not that you necessarily always need to think about doing breathing exercises with them. It might be the fact that you just need to encourage them every now and again, maybe breathe a little bit deeper, and to just check in on those things. Similarly, they might be breathing very, very deeply at the moment. And I know we need to be very mindful about respiratory currently, but just checking on those things and seeing what breathing patterns have adapted would be a really good idea. Giving them outlets for tension as well, actually gripping things, pushing, pulling, all of those different things. Any physical activity that we can do in our provisions at the moment to support key workers' children is a really good idea, because obviously, that those adaptations lie within our nervous systems, and we can hold those until we have an outlet. So things like throwing, pushing, pulling, all of those different things are really good for a release of tension. But similarly, it works in terms of what we call progressive muscle release. That actually, a lot of people will tense things, and then that feeling of letting go afterwards means that we're also releasing elements of shock from our system as well. So any tension grips or any physical activities that you can do around that, both in the home and at school, would be a really good idea to work physically with these things, especially if our children aren't necessarily able to articulate it. So, working on a physical level as well as an emotional level is often very useful, because it means that we've got a two-pronged approach to actually the conversations, but also some of the physical strategies that we can use. So I hope that's been helpful. I mean, and it's only very brief, I do understand that. But I just want to finish on two things. Firstly, understand at the moment, I mean, many of you will know, but it's classic Maslow, isn't it? That actually at the moment we've got quite a big invasion of our physical and psychological safety. Many of us are focused on elements of survival. Many of us are focused on all of those different concerns at the moment around food, all of those things. It's entirely understandable. So understand that at the moment we need to make sure that we're all doing those basics very, very well in order to access the higher order thinking, executive functioning, all of those different things that we sometimes need within our jobs. What's really difficult at the moment is having to do all of these different things whilst focusing on the bigger picture of what's happening in the country and around the world. So understanding that those basics, I'm not just talking about healthy sleeps, I'm talking about the ability to be able to get a little bit of fresh air, maybe by yourself on your doorstep, some just 5 minutes of time, breathing, and being able to keep hydrated well, being able to understand how much we're currently sitting with and holding, all of those different things. I've been fortunate enough that I've got a step just outside my front door in a very small front garden, but I go there in the evening just for 10 minutes, just so that I can have that time. I don't necessarily do anything in that time, but it's just some time that I put aside to make sure that I can breathe and that I've got some time to process things. So doing the basics very well is very important in order for us to do all the other complex stuff that we're doing. I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you that are doing so much for our young people, for our families, for our community, for our country right now. And I really do hope that you have some ability to take good care of yourself and that people are looking after you as well. So take good care, stay safe, and know that you're in our thoughts. And know that we are here should you need anything, and we will continue to be here over the coming months and weeks ahead. I hope that's been useful. Look after yourselves and keep in touch with us and let us know if there's anything else that we can do for you.